I told myself I was only coming back for a weekend, 48 hours, tops, sign the papers, box what little was left of my mother's life, and be gone before Sunday's first church bell. That was the plan. But plans don't mean much on a road you swore you'd never drive again. The county line sneaks up on you at dusk. One moment there's sky enough for 3 states. The next, the trees knit themselves overhead, and the light turns the color of weak tea. The asphalt narrows, the shoulders crumble, and the air changes. Sweeter somehow, like old apples and damp hay. I cracked the window even though the AC worked fine. Smell is the only thing that will ever convince you you're home. The sign for Holyfield stood tilted on one post, its peeling white letters half buried in kudzu. Welcome to Holyfield, Pop 2611. Someone had spray painted a smiley face through the 0. The face was missing its eyes. I didn't think about the bell until I passed mile marker 5. That's how it always is. You don't remember the bell, you notice the quiet that comes before it. The radio lost its signal without static, like it had given up politely. Cicadas fell into a synchronized hush. My tires stopped humming. Even my breath sounded distant, as if my body were a church I was standing outside of. Then, faint and far and familiar, the bell. It isn't the clang of metal on metal, not really. It's lower, flatter, like the sound an old piano makes when you strike a key that was never tuned. One note, then another after an impossible stretch of silence, and another. It comes from nowhere and everywhere at once. Down in the creek bed, up in the silo, under your own tongue. The bell doesn't measure time so much as smear it. That's what we were told when we were kids. If you hear the 5-mile bell, don't count. Counting makes it come closer. I didn't count. My hands tightened on the wheel until the leather creaked. I'd told myself about 3 dozen lies on the drive from the city, but none of them were sturdy enough to sit on. Not the one about how the house would be easy, clean, sell, gone. Not the one about how the neighbors would remember me kindly. Not the biggest one, the one with teeth. The bell is a nursery story. The bell is nothing. Holyfield made specialists out of us. We learned to pass each other fresh lies like salt at supper. The road curved past Ward's orchard on the left. In September, the place would glow like someone had plugged the trees directly into the sun. But now, early summer, the fruit was still hard and green. The scarecrow looked different. We'd made him in 5th grade, Mrs. Fleet's class, stuffing a Goodwill suit with straw and giving him my father's old church hat. When Mrs. Fleet said a scarecrow needed a hat to be worth a damn, we took a picture with him. We stuck the picture on the cafeteria bulletin board with 3 pushpins, like a warning. Tonight, the scarecrow was taller. The suit didn't hang right. The hat sat low enough that I couldn't see the face, but the impression of a face was there anyway, like something pressing outward from under the burlap. I didn't slow down. The house sits back from the road behind a stand of sycamores that shed like frightened dogs. When I pulled into the gravel, the front porch light blinked on, even though nobody had been home for months. Motion sensor, I told myself. Squirrel. Wind. The bell's 3rd note, if it was the 3rd, threaded the air like a seam you could catch your nail on. I killed the engine and the hush fell whole. Gravel popped under my shoes. The porch steps had sunk an inch at the left edge and complained like bones when I climbed them. The key was where it always had been, in the pottery frog with the cracked smile and the hollow belly. My mother used to joke that Frog was the greediest thing in Holyfield, always eating keys, never eating flies. The lock turned. The door stuck for a breath, then let me in with a sigh that raised the hair on my arms. Houses carry their own weather, and this one had been storing storms. It smelled like lemon oil and dust and something else, a faint metallic tang I couldn't place, like pennies in a jar. My mother's sofa sat under the front window as if she'd only just stood up, her afghan folded along the top like a sleeping cat. The cross-stitch over the mantel still said, "Bless this mess," in thread that had faded to the color of dishwater. I put my bag down and touched the back of the sofa, because that's what you do in a museum. Prove to yourself the velvet isn't painted. My fingers came away gritty. A fine gray powder clung to the whorls of my fingertips. Plaster, ash. I rubbed it on my jeans and it didn't quite disappear. The bell came again, closer now, and the glass in the picture frames shivered. I should have called someone. I should have done 1,000 small, responsible things. Checked the breaker, checked the crawl space, checked that Frog hadn't eaten the spare key out of spite. Instead, I went to the kitchen because the kitchen holds the truth of a house, and because I wanted water, and because some childish part of me believed that if I opened the refrigerator and saw food, the world would go back to being a world. The kitchen was colder than it should have been, colder than the house, colder than outside. I opened the fridge and found a single item on the center shelf, a mason jar of cloudy liquid with a square of masking tape on the lid. My mother's handwriting, wet wool neat, don't drink before Sunday. Someone had scratched the word don't with a key or a knife. The letters peeled up like old paint. I stood there with the cold seeping into my skin and tried to make a timeline. Mom died in March. It was June. The power bill had been paid through April and then the bank had frozen the account. There shouldn't have been power at all. There certainly shouldn't have been a jar that looked like it had been placed there yesterday. A note that looked like it had been written this afternoon. A warning that had been vandalized by a steadier hand than grief gives you. The fridge hummed. The bell answered it, or the other way around. It's hard to tell which noises belong to you in Holyfield. I closed the door gently, like I didn't want to wake something. The digital clock on the stove blinked 12 o'clock in green. A lie. I pressed the button to set it, to give my hands something to do, and the numbers sped like a slot machine, blurring toward a time that never arrived. I let it go. The stove kept blinking 12 o'clock, more insistent now, as if that were the only hour the house believed in. The phone rang. The landline was still on the wall by the back door. When I was little, I had to stand on a chair to reach it. I didn't have to stand on anything now, but my hand still reached toward the chair that wasn't there. The bell rang again. A tone that didn't belong to my mother's cheap blue handset. It sounded older, rotary, the kind of ring you hear in a movie when the operator interrupts to say there's a call from the hospital. I answered because I am that kind of fool. "Hello," I said, and my voice sounded like someone else's, a substitute teacher trying to take attendance. Breathing, not heavy, not threatening, just present, like the sound of a tide moving under a dock. "Mom?" The word left me without consultation. A pause, like someone had to cross a room to get to me. Then a woman's voice, distant and clear, as if she were standing in my kitchen in another year. "I told you Sunday," she said. "You never could wait." The line clicked. The dial tone came, thin and busy, then folded into the silence like a sheet. I put the receiver back on the hook and looked at the back door, because the human animal is always making openings into exits. The window above the sink was black. My face looked back at me, a low-budget haunting. In the glass behind my reflection, something moved. It wasn't in the yard. It wasn't in the house. It was inside the window itself, in the layer between panes where bugs sometimes die and become crisp little question marks. A small moth beat against the glass, dusting the air with powder. Under it, pale as a drowned thing, a fingertip pressed outward on the inside of the window's skin. It dragged slowly, leaving a clear path through the fogged-on condensation that hadn't been there a heartbeat ago. The path curved, hooked, knotted into letters. Sunday. There was no mistaking the handwriting. My mother's. The bell tolled, nearer than it had any right to be, and the light over the sink flickered as if it had been called by name. My phone vibrated in my pocket. I fumbled it out by reflex, grateful for the little rectangle of the modern world. No bars, no Wi-Fi, no clock either. The time section was a blank strip of gray, but there was a notification, white against the dark. Photos, memory from 1 year ago. Ward's orchard with Mom. I tapped it. The picture filled the screen. My mother stood in front of the scarecrow with her arm hooked through mine. Both of us grinning like we'd been paid. The hat was too big for the scarecrow, it always had been. But in the photo, it sat low enough to hide the eyes. If there were eyes. I pinched the screen to zoom. The pixels sharpened. Under the brim, in the shadow that shouldn't have kept shape, Two pale ovals looked back at me. The kitchen light hummed. The moth beat itself to dust. The fingertip withdrew from the window, leaving the word to fog again, slowly, as if the glass were breathing. I didn't realize I was too until it hurt. I told myself I would wait until Sunday. I told myself I would lock the back door. I told myself I would not, under any circumstances, go out towards Orchard after dark. I am very good at telling myself things. Holyfield trained me. And still, when something moved on the porch, the soft weight of a single step finding old wood, I forgot every rule my small life had ever taught me and turned toward the sound. The bell paused. The house listened. The door began to open. The door didn't so much open as it yielded, like the wood had been waiting all along for the right pressure from the other side. It swung inward in one slow, deliberate motion. No rush, no creak, just the cold that came with it, colder than the kitchen, colder than the fridge, settling on my skin like wet cloth. I stood rooted, one hand still on the counter, the other hovering uselessly in the air. My first thought was wind. My second was that wind didn't smell like this. Sharp, metallic, like rain on rust. The porch light threw a thin strip of illumination onto the threshold, but it seemed to stop there, as if the air beyond it were too dense for light to pass through. A figure took shape inside that strip, edges soft and uncommitted, like a photograph coming up in darkroom chemicals. It was tall, a head taller than the frame, but somehow stooped, shoulders canted inward like it had bent itself to fit inside human spaces. The hat was wrong for the weather, broad-brimmed and black, heavy wool maybe, pulled low enough to cast the upper face in shadow. "Hello," the word came out thin, no answer, just the sound of slow breathing, the kind that doesn't care if you hear it. I told myself it was a neighbor, that maybe somebody had seen my mother's light on after months of dark and decided to check in. That was the story I tried to believe, while my fingers worked the edge of the countertop hard enough to find splinters. Then it stepped forward and the light hit the lower half of its face. The mouth was wrong, not deformed, just wrong. The lips looked like they had been painted on, too red, too neat, and fixed in a line that wasn't quite a smile and wasn't quite nothing. The skin around it was pale and tight, like something stretched over a shape it hadn't been meant for. "Who are you?" I asked, and immediately wished I hadn't, because questions are invitations in Holyfield. It didn't speak. It lifted one arm, too long, and in its hand was something small and white. The hand itself was wrapped in leather gloves, old ones, the kind you find at the bottom of a trunk. The thing in its grip wasn't paper. It was a Polaroid. My Polaroid. It was of me, standing in my mother's kitchen just now, looking toward the door as if I'd known it was coming. The light in the picture matched the light in the room. My face in the photo looked frozen mid-breath. I don't remember crossing the floor, but suddenly I was slamming the door hard enough to make the glass rattle. My palms stuck to the wood from sweat, my breath shaking like something trying to get free. When I dared to look through the side window, the porch was empty. The sycamores outside swayed in a wind I couldn't hear. The frog by the steps still smiled its cracked smile, but the Polaroid was tucked neatly between the doorframe and the storm door, waiting for me to take it. I didn't touch the Polaroid at first. I stared at it the way you stare at a spider, convinced that if you blink, it will vanish and prove you invented it. It didn't vanish. The white border glowed softly in the porch light, and the little square of me inside the kitchen looked too sharp, like a portrait a stranger took while I wasn't looking. I slid it free with 2 fingers, careful not to smudge the image. The chemistry was fully set, no dampness, no heat. On the back, someone had written in pencil, soft and careful, the way my mother wrote names under photos in her albums. Mile marker 0. The graphite had pressed an indent into the paper you could feel with your skin. I took it to the table and laid it flat, as if it might try to run. The house hummed around me, slow and low, a throat clearing for a word it couldn't say. The bell didn't come. The silence where it should have been felt like static. I don't know how long I sat there, watching myself in the photo, watch the door. Eventually, my hands remembered they belonged to me and went for the drawer that still held batteries and rubber bands and dead pens. There was a flashlight at the back, the old yellow one from the glove compartment with a cracked lens. It flickered when I tested it, then steadied like it had decided I was worth the effort. "I won't go," I told the empty room. "I won't." The room didn't argue. My mother's handwriting on the jar lid had been so clear, and the scratched-out "don't" so stubborn, that I felt a kind of childish defiance blooming in my chest. When your mother tells you not to do a thing, you do it, if only to prove she still has weight in the world. I went back to the fridge. The jar sat like a small winter under fluorescence. I set it on the counter and turned the lid. Cold bled into my palm. The seal let go with a tiny sigh, and a smell rose up that wasn't drink and wasn't food. Sharp, green, faintly sweet, like wet hay in a cellar. I couldn't see anything inside but clouded liquid and a soft twist of something dark that might have been hair or root. A moth thudded, soft as a fingertip, against the kitchen light. Something out in the sycamores shook their leaves like laughter in another room. I raised the jar, and the liquid inside swirled slow. There was a name under the smell, a memory my tongue almost found. The creek under Ward's orchard, the way it tasted when we dared each other to drink from cupped hands, the iron of it, and the man the green. I put the jar down harder than I meant to. "Sunday," I said to the lid. "Sunday." The Polaroid looked back at me as if to say, "Then why has the clock never moved?" I took the flashlight and the jar and left the house before I could vote against it. The porch boards flexed reluctantly under my weight. The night felt a degree colder just beyond the swing of the bulb, the kind of cold a church has, no matter the season. When I stepped off the last stair, the gravel answered in a voice older than my mother's, and the bell came at last. One thick note that trembled the jar against my palm. "Don't count," I told myself. "Counting makes it come closer." Ward's orchard wasn't far as a crow flies, but crows are liars. You have to take the road that loops along the pasture and dips by the creek and climbs again, a quarter-mile that is always longer on the way there. My flashlight made a tunnel out of the dark. The sycamores kept pace like escort or guard. Somewhere to my left, something small rushed through grass and stopped dead, mind calculating whether I was a problem that would pass. By the time the fence posts began, I had almost convinced myself I'd walk to the edge, look at the scarecrow from the safe side of a boundary, and walk back. The orchard lay ahead in orderly rows, the young apples like green knuckles, the air hanging with a sleep sweetness. The scarecrow's field is what we called that first stand, not because the scarecrow lived there. He stood at the far end where the ground sank toward the creek, but because that was where we could see him without him seeing us. Children believe distance works like walls. I came to the gate and found it open. That wasn't right. Mr. Ward had been the closing kind, a man who believed in chain and clasp for anything that could wander. Since he died, there wasn't a Mr. Ward to lock anything, but I'd never seen the gate ajar. Tonight it yawned a hand's width, as if I'd left in a hurry and forgot what I was taught. The bell waited while I put my hand on the wood. The jar in my other hand felt heavier now, as if something had woken at the cold and leaned. I slipped through and made myself close the gate behind me, because the rituals you keep are all that stands between you and a story that happens to someone else. The orchard took me in. The trees here breathe differently. That's something you'd know if you grew up under their shade. In daylight, they smell like work. At night, they smell like a promise you were never meant to hear. I walked the rows, my light sliding along trunks, finding the little nails in the bark where Mr. Ward used to hang his buckets when he bled the cider too early. The ground tilted under my feet with the memory of childhood running. Halfway down the third row, I saw the hat. It hovered above the trees ahead, the brim just visible in the band of night. The body below it was shadow. I couldn't see the face and didn't want to. My light skittered away from him by its own will, like water that won't cling to oil. My heart had found a rhythm just off from the bells. I could feel the two trying to meet and failing. I would have stopped there, made a bargain with whatever god still accepted bargains, if not for the glimmer at the base of the scarecrow's post. A small white square leaned against the wood, bright as a tooth. Another Polaroid. He didn't move when I approached. He never moved when we were children. That was the rule. But rules have a way of revealing who they serve. I kept my beam low, lighting the grass, lighting my own shoes, lighting the jar where it trembled. The nearer I came, the more the hat's shadow insisted. It made a little night all its own. The photo showed the gate. It showed me slipping through it. The angle was wrong for a man. The angle was right for something that stands at the height of a crow's dream. On the back, in pencil, mile marker 1. Fine, I said aloud, because when you are alone, you become your own jury. There's a map. I understand that. I don't like it, but I understand it. The jar tugged in my grip as if something inside wanted to see. I set it carefully against the post. The scarecrow didn't look down. His hat brim made a shore the light could not cross. Why Sunday? I asked the field. Why write it and scratch it and ring and not count? The orchard answered by breathing in all at once. Every leaf lifted and settled. 100,000 small hands made a sound like old paper. The creek below clicked stone to stone, a blind person finding a face by touch. A moth battered itself to dusk on my flashlight lens and fell. And when it fell, it didn't quite reach the ground, caught on a filament of web so fine it turned the beam into a visible thread. Cicadas began again, but not where they had left off. The bell kept its own counsel. The scarecrow's hat nudged, a half-inch maybe, a politeness of motion. It could have been wind. It could have been breath. I crouched and reached for the jar. Condensation had gathered on the glass. Someone, something, had drawn a line through the fog with a fingertip inside the kitchen, writing Sunday. Now here outside, a new line formed on the jar, slow and patient, as if a finger were sliding along the inside of the glass. It traced a curve, then a straight, then a small hooked tail, an S. I snatched my hand back like it had hit an element. The jar rocked, steadied, and went on writing without me. The next letter formed, sleepy and sure. You. I didn't wait for the word to finish. I grabbed the jar, tucked the new Polaroid into my jacket pocket like a stolen thing, and backed away, the flashlight beam stuttering across grass and trunk. The scarecrow kept his hat where heaven ends. If he had eyes, they were under there, and if he had a mouth, it was the whole orchard. I reached the gate and did not look down at the photo it would soon hold. I kept my face toward the road and the sycamores and the house that had been my mother's and would be mine until paper made a different claim. Only when the fence wood was against my shoulder did I lift the jar to the light. 2 letters more had appeared while I fled, the strokes delicate and clean. The word would be whole soon enough without my help. S-U-N-D. I closed my eyes hard enough to make light bloom red in the lids. When I opened them, the word hadn't advanced. For now, the bell gave me one more measure, low and patient. Somewhere beyond the trees, a second bell answered, higher and thinner, the kind you hear at the back door when a dog wants in. I shut the gate. I set the latch. I didn't count. The road back had changed, not in shape. You can't fool a body that grew out of its dust, but in time. The flashlight made the gravel look like stars. My breath smoked, though the air wasn't cold enough for that, and each cloud hung where I left it, like a ghost, rehearsing its first day. When I reached the sycamores, their bark looked like old maps peeled from walls, and I wanted suddenly, terribly, to be a child again, to know that running fast was the same thing as running away. On the porch, the frog grinned with its old, cracked mouth. Something had been set on its head, with care. A third Polaroid, still warm from whatever shadow had taken it. I didn't need to turn it over to know what penciled label I'd find. I turned it anyway. The back said, mile marker 2. The front showed me in the orchard, crouched at the scarecrow's post, looking small enough to put in a pocket. The jar in my hand had stopped writing. The letters inside gleamed faintly like fish near the surface in a night pond, then settled back into the clouded liquid and were gone. Behind me, in the dark beyond the sycamores, something taller than a man moved once, like a tree deciding it had chosen the wrong place to grow. I opened the door and stepped into the house like the house had chosen me. The bell waited to see if I would count, and when I didn't, It rolled its one great note through the kitchen and into the hall and up the stairs, waking the pictures as it went. I locked the back door. I put the jar in the sink. I set the Polaroids in a row like candles on a mantel. Then I turned out the light and listened to the house breathe until my body remembered how to do it too. Somewhere between one breath and the next, the phone rang. The phone's ring cut through the house like a blade pulled slow through cloth. Familiar, but wrong. Not the brittle chime of my mother's landline this time. This was deeper, slower, like a grandfather clock had learned to speak. It was coming from upstairs. Every step on the staircase sounded too loud, as if the wood were warning whatever was at the top. The air grew heavier with each rise, warm in some spots, cold in others, as though the house couldn't agree on a season. I passed the wall of family photographs, faces half lit by the glow creeping up from the hallway lamp. My father's portrait seemed to follow me, his painted smile thinner than I remembered. The phone sat on the nightstand in my mother's old bedroom, only it wasn't hers. The one she'd had was a cheap, cordless gray plastic, buttons worn smooth. This was different, heavy black rotary polished to a shine, the kind of thing you'd see in an office decades before I was born. The cord trailed off the side and disappeared into nothing. It rang again. I thought about letting it stop, letting it ring until the sound faded like mist. But the thought of standing in the room with it and not answering felt worse. The receiver was cold, almost painfully so. Hello? A pause. Not breathing this time, something like wind on stone far away. Then, in a voice that was not my mother's but had her rhythm, the words, "Mile marker 3. My skin went tight, every nerve shrinking away from the air. I wanted to ask who it was. I wanted to ask what the markers meant, how many there would be, but my throat had locked. Before I could think, I heard another sound, so soft I almost missed it. A faint scrape, the shuffle of paper. Then the unmistakable click of a Polaroid ejecting from a camera. I turned toward the bedroom door. Down the hall, on the carpet, sat a fresh photograph, still curling at the edges from the heat of developing chemicals. I stepped out and picked it up. The picture showed me, standing exactly where I was, holding the phone. But in the photo, my other hand was holding the jar. The jar was not in my room. A shadow stretched across the hall in the picture, long and thin, falling from somewhere behind me. I turned fast, the receiver still in my hand. The hallway was empty, but the bell began again, closer than it had ever been. And for the first time, I counted 1, 2, 3. The house seemed to lean toward the sound, and somewhere outside, past the sycamores, the orchard, and the mile markers I hadn't reached yet, something counted with me. The counting stopped, but the silence left in its place was worse. So full it felt like sound under the skin. The receiver hung from my hand, cold as stone. I didn't remember letting it slip from my ear, but it swung gently. The cord taut as if something on the other end were still holding on. A faint vibration worked its way up my arm. I looked down. The phone wasn't moving, but the Polaroid I'd picked up in the hall was trembling between my fingers. The image was still me, still this hallway, but now, where there had been only shadow before, a figure stood at the far end. Hat low, face hidden, long arms stretched toward me as if to offer something. I didn't want to know what. The jar was still in the kitchen sink where I'd left it. I told myself that, like a fact, could be an anchor. If the jar was there, I was safe here. I'd been measuring my safety in objects since the moment I crossed into Holyfield. But when I got to the bottom of the stairs, the sink was empty. The jar sat on the table instead, lid off, a thin trail of liquid arcing across the wood as if it had been carried there carelessly. The writing inside was back, faint but growing darker. S-U-N-D-A-Y. The last letter was forming itself, the tail of the Y curling slow like it wanted to savor the final stroke. I didn't touch it. I couldn't. I just watched as the last line connected, and the word was whole. The bell sounded again, not from the orchard this time, not from anywhere outside. It rang from the jar. A pale fog began to seep from the open mouth, spilling over the rim and crawling toward the edge of the table. When it touched the floor, it moved like it knew where it was going, straight for the back door. The door unlocked itself with a click. Through the thin glass, the sycamores leaned away, creating a corridor of moonlight down the path toward Ward's orchard. And there, just at the first tree line, another flash of white, a Polaroid pinned to the bark. The bell rang a second time from the jar, louder, impatient. My body felt both heavier and lighter, pulled forward like I'd been chosen for something I didn't want. My bare feet found the cold wood of the porch, then the damp grit of the path. The air tasted of iron and apples. When I reached the photo, I pulled it free without looking, too afraid of seeing my own face again. On the back, mile marker 4. The bell tolled once more, echoing through the orchard. Somewhere ahead, past the rows of trees and the creek, a final Polaroid waited. And I knew, without being told, that mile marker 5 wasn't a place. It was an ending.